What do I need to be good at to be great at something?
Hello, everyone. You are listening to She Leads with Carly, and in this show, we talk to the absolute best, brightest, and yes, badass leaders.
Tap into where your natural curiosity takes you. Just making sure you're not your own roadblock. Even if you do fall, you're going to fall and you're going to learn.
Together, let's build a DNA of what it takes to rise to the top and truly make an impact. I'm your host, Carly Malatsky. Hello, everyone. I am super excited to welcome our guest today, Celine Halioua. Celine is the founder and CEO of Loyal, a biotech startup developing drugs to extend dog lifespan. Yes, you heard that right, dog lifespan. Before founding Loyal, Celine worked at the Longevity Fund, a venture capital fund investing in therapies with the potential to extend human lifespan. Celine studied the health economics of gene therapy while attending Oxford for her PhD. Prior to Oxford, she received her Bachelors in Neuroscience and Nanobiotechnology at the University of Texas at Austin and at University in Sweden. Interestingly, Celine received a full-ride scholarship to attend University of Texas in art. Quite different from the path she ended up taking, which we will get into. But first, welcome, Celine. Thanks for joining the pod.
Thank you.
So first, Celine, set the scene for us. Where are you in the world? What are you up to?
I am drinking my first coffee. I'm in San Francisco. Scandalous, I know. I'm sitting in my apartment. My dog is sleeping on my backpack, which is a little inconvenient because my charger is in there that I need. But I can't stand to wake her up. So I'll do it when I'm forced to.
Oh my God. I love that. And I could see the overcast San Francisco air behind you.
All that fog. Yeah.
All right. So Celine, you know this, but what I love to do at the beginning of every show is go back to 5-year-old Celine. Who were you as a child? Where did you grow up? And what type of kid were you?
I grew up in Austin, Texas. My mom's Moroccan and my dad's German. They're both straight off the metaphorical boat, so to speak. So I don't remember this, but apparently I had a very strong accent when I was a kid.
Moroccan or German? Which side?
I think it was like some weird mix. I know they put me in speech therapy when I was in elementary school because they thought I had a lisp. But it turns out, like in German, the word for the is der, die, or das, depending on the gender of the following word. Yeah. So I said the dog, the cat, which they literally had to teach me how to do the. But yeah, as a kid, I know I was a really big animal lover. I mean, that was probably the biggest thing. We had like 15 cats, 3 dogs, hamsters. We like took care of wildlife that we found. So I would say that's probably like my most defining trait as a child. And I guess maybe now too.
And then during school, did you like school? Were you very academic? Were you into the sciences back then or not so much?
No, I wasn't. Well, it was a bit of a mix. I did the science fairs and I often did very well in them. But I also was really non-studious and often skipped class. In fact, I probably skipped 1 day a week when I was in high school, which my teachers did not love for me. And I know in high school, I think I graduated in like the bottom 10 of my class, but I also went to like a public, like smart kids school. So like maybe not as bad to be in the bottom 10 of that. I don't know. I definitely was not studious and definitely, not destined for the Ivy League path in middle and high school.
And when you grew up, obviously, like I said in the intro, you ended up getting a full ride scholarship to Texas for art. So one, where did that passion for art come through? And were you thinking of your career almost in this art lens? Or how were you thinking long term?
I wasn't thinking about anything. I just was, it's like I liked art. I wanted to go to UT. I wasn't going to get in for normal stuff. right? My GPA wasn't good enough, but I had nearly perfect test scores. And I was pretty good at art. So I was
Wow.
like, well, I can apply to art. And then obviously I got that scholarship, but then I remember we did the it was studio art, the pre-department tour. And I remember this moment, we were like standing in front of some statue, pontificating about the meaning of the statue. And I was like, I'm going to kill myself. Like, I can't do this. Um, and thankfully, at that point, I was already interested in science. I'd always been interested in science in retrospect. I just didn't really realize that. And so I just switched to neuroscience. And yeah, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to do that anymore. But I did. And it worked out well for me.
Okay, so in my mind, going from art to neuroscience is drastically different, right? Everything about it, the class, the departments, everything. So walk me a little bit through that intention to go to neuroscience. Were you thinking of long-term? Because right now in college, people are choosing their degrees often with, what can this take me to? Where can this lead me? So how were you thinking through that, if at all, that it was going to be helping you in your future career?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the stories of my life is not having a lot of context until I dive into something. I didn't know of any careers besides doctor, lawyer, scientist, businessman, right?
Right.
Like, I didn't even know what consulting or any of that stuff was, because that's also like an Ivy League kid opportunity type of thing. I only learned about that world when I went to Oxford. So I decided to study neuroscience because with the context I had at the time, I thought that neuroscience was the discipline where in the first class they're telling you, we don't really know. We don't really know how memory works. We don't really know how anything works. And here's our current hypotheses, right? Versus my interpretation, which is of course incorrect, but at the time was that when you study basic human biology or whatever, you're spending so much of it catching up to current human knowledge. And then maybe at the end of the 4 years, you're hitting novelty or the questions. Now, of course, that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of complexity and they teach you simplified versions of everything. But that was 18-year-old, 19-year-old Celine's philosophy. And then so I did it.
And walk me a little bit through post UT. What is the timeline looking like when you decided to pursue a PhD at Oxford and then ultimately you end up dropping out, which we'll get to. But what was in between? Was the longevity fun in between that, or when did you end up discovering?
So no, I was at UT. So I was at UT. I thought I was going to do medicine because that's what people who like biology and people do is medicine. And I was going the whole pre-med path. And I kind of had this nagging feeling in the back of my head that I didn't want to be a doctor. I was no, I have to suppress that urge. I'm going to be a neurosurgeon. And then I had been doing, sorry, this is blast from the past. I had been doing summer research in neurodegenerative disorders, specifically Parkinson's and La Jolla at the Sanford Burnham-Purvis Medical Discovery Institute. And I presented my research and an Oxford prof was there. And he was like, you're cool. You should apply to join my PhD program. And I was like, no, I'm going to med school. And we and a couple of other people had dinner and they were just trying to convince me the entire time. And then I remember the moment where I decided it actually would make sense to go to Oxford is I had lunch with a medical professional, an MD, talking about wanting to go to med school, and he said something like, you're going to need to justify why you went to a school like UT Austin. And I was like, sorry, what? And he was like, yeah, why didn't you go to Yale or Harvard? And I was like, oh, and that was and he wasn't wrong. He wasn't being an asshole. It's just is true, right?
Okay.
And I was like, that was a light bulb for me. It's I'm going to be, potentially dealing with a suboptimal situation if I don't have something Ox on my CV. So it was strategic too. I wanted a proxy for people knowing I'm smart without talking to me. So I decided to apply and I went.
Looking at just that last bit of the story, right, is having to almost overcompensate given that you went to UT, if you will. What advice do you have for maybe others in that similar position? They're not going to the IVs and getting that badge, on their degree. How do you think about it now to say the best steps to advocate for yourself, even if you don't go to that top 8 school?
I think just have like a reality and comprehension of how the world works. And degrees and where you went to school and where you worked are one of many proxies, and definitely in your early career, a major proxy that people use to determine whether it's worth reading your resume or doing that first interview. And you can overcome that, right? Like one, you need to have the knowledge and the context. That's most important. That's what actually like gets you the opportunity in the situation, or gets you to succeed in this opportunity that you get. But you can build it up in other ways if you don't have that. I decided to go to Ox. You don't have to go to Oxford to deal with that. Right. You just have to, I think it's just being like radically aware and not being in denial of the inequities that exist in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And Celine, so did you end up taking the MCAT, or did you put, doctor, neurosurgeon aside and you were now like, okay, I'm going a different path?
I thought I was going to do the MD, or I thought I was going to do PhD and then go back and do an MD in like Europe or something.
Got it. Okay.
Because it's also free. That was the other thing. Like medical school in the States is stupid expensive, 6%, 7% interest rate, probably higher now on those loans. And I'm a German citizen. So I was like, I'm just going to go to Netherlands because they have a English, Dutch, medical school there. But yeah, clearly did not happen.
Okay. So walk me a bit through, you end up dropping out of your PhD program. And ultimately, you joined the Longevity Fund. At what point did you discover this passion for aging, right? And whether it's human, whether it's dog, we'll get into it. But at what point did you say, you know what, this is fascinating to me and I want to dive into it?
Probably my sophomore year. So when I was doing research at that neurodegenerative clinic, or the group that I was working at was working on stem cells to replace the lost dopaminergic neurons in Parkinson's patients. And I just remember sitting there thinking, this is so damn complex. And why are we trying to restore this patient's, function after, or only intervening once they have lost function, so much function, instead of trying to prevent it or slow the rate of decline. And so the group that sponsored me to go work in La Jolla was an aging nonprofit. And I thought they kind of are full of shit, but I really thought they were full of shit back then. A little like, they're full of shit. They're great. Oh, nope, they're full of shit. But right. I didn't accept the internship because of aging. I accepted it because I wanted to work on neurodegenerative disorders. But they psyoped me, and they psyoped me correctly. I will give them credit for that. And I became really interested in that, and in also how medicines get approved and make it to market.
And throughout your entire career up before founding Loyal, which I'm excited to get to because I think it's a fascinating founding story. But what have you learned by almost the dynamic between your manager and yourself? Or whether it's manager, advisor, professor, whatever that power dynamic is, what are some lessons that you've learned that have taught you to be a better leader, or that you've taken with you to Loyal?
I haven't had that many managerial situations. I have 3 that come to mind. My very first job, the gelato shop, who called me an idiot savant. So I think we're going to throw him out. Then
how old were you during that? How old are you?
I was like a freshman in college.
Okay.
I worked a lot during undergrad, and I had a bunch of these random jobs. I was a terrible employee. Oh my God. I would never hire myself. Terrible. I was like, why do I have to vacuum? I vacuumed yesterday. You need a vacuum every day. That's what's in the closing. It's fine. There's nothing on the floor. I don't need a vacuum. No, Celine, you have to vacuum.
I think that's the first sneak of, the founder hat coming in. But yeah. That's great.
And I had my professor, and then I had Laura, and then I had myself. And I would say the thing I learned from my professor is that hierarchy is bullshit. I, of course, as you know, had a bit of a suboptimal situation at Oxford, which is one of the reasons why I left. And that centered around one of my professors. And I just remember thinking, like, this man is so incompetent, and his incompetency, he handled it by being allegedly harassing, mentally abusive, things like that. And I just remember thinking, like, oh, like, this doesn't mean anything. Like, his title doesn't mean anything. His position in the university doesn't mean anything. He's doing this to control me because he knows, in my perspective, he knew I was cleverer than him. And instead of like leveraging that, he just, I don't know, insecure.
Right.
And so that was actually extremely helpful because it helped me realize that all these, oh, Oxford's a good school, and oh, you have a PhD, oh, you have an MD PhD, or whatever it is. Like, it's just all like human bullshit that we create to kind of put some control into our chaotic world. And of course, like, I want somebody operating on me who has an MD, right? Like, I'm not saying like throw out the entire system, but it does give a degree of flexibility that I think growing up, like middle class or middle class, like people who don't grow up with like context for the world, the controlling people or whatever, it takes a long time to realize like how much of that is put on you. And then from Laura was the opposite of that, right? Laura like just created her own opportunities and created her competency and didn't ask anybody for permission and did something totally new when she was 16 or 17. And I learned a lot from that too. She's always been a role model for me.
In those moments, and I don't even want to harp on that PhD experience, but question for you, for people who don't necessarily have that ability to say, okay, I'm going to go found my own company, or I'm going to step out of this, and hierarchy is bullshit, but instead they're forced to stay in a sense, right? Whether it's a PhD program that they do complete or any type of structure. What is a good mechanism to actually succeed in that environment and function well in that environment?
I don't know if I have good advice for that. Like, I didn't. I just dealt with it for a while. I was in a similar situation. I didn't want to drop out. And I was like proud to be going there. I liked my PhD program. I liked my other profs, the whole thing. And then I ended up doing it because he found out that I was like talking about the situation to the administrators, and he pulled my funding. And then at that point I was like, well, I can't stay anyhow, so fuck you. I'm going nuclear. And it turns out that personality trait is very foundery. But I will totally. I've definitely gone nuclear a few times when it strategically made sense and when it was right. Like, that's how I always have thought about it. And I mean, I think it's very difficult to succeed in a situation. And one of the things that made me go nuclear is that I found out there were multiple women before me who had the same situation. One of them had to restart her PhD entirely. That's literally 2 to 3 years of her life, like, lost to this idiot. Like, you can't get that back.
Yeah.
And so at that point I was like, fuck it.
Yeah.
So I think you just have to take control of the situation.
I love that. And ultimately, you end up finding Laura and the Longevity Fund. And beyond the decision to join that fund, was there also an interest in VC particularly, or what made you say this is my next path and this makes sense for me?
I wanted to understand how new medicines got funded. And I was interested in longevity. I didn't want to be a VC. There was a short period of time when I was like, I want to be a VC. And then I'm like, this is a fucking terrible job. I'd be a terrible VC. But I was interested in how new medicines get funded, and obviously interested in longevity and supporting that field. And I thought supporting the way I thought about it was like this distributed theory of impact, right? If I help Laura invest in 20 companies that wouldn't have otherwise been funded because a lot of longevity stuff is really niche, and one of them or two of them develop a new medicine that helps however many thousands of people, then I'm like responsible for some tiny, tiny sliver of that positive social good. And so that's why I decided to do it.
And when you look at your career now, and you've been vocal about this, where throughout your life, you didn't really see yourself as a founder. Like, it wasn't, something that was talked about. And so at what point did you have that light bulb where you're like, you know what, maybe I will go and do it, and maybe I will be the actual driver?
When I had the term sheet.
So walk me through that story. I think it's a great story about Greg Rosen, right? Is the one that gave you your first term sheet. You did a campfire in Silicon Valley. Walk a little bit through that story and how that came about.
It's my favorite story. So I had been working on the ideas, specifically scientific ideas behind Loyal while at Longevity Fund. So the context is I'd become frustrated while at Longevity Fund because every company that pitched us for reasonable reasons had the same narrative. Like, oh, we have this drug, it extends lifespan and health span in mice. Aging, FDA is evil. Aging isn't a disease. So we're developing this aging drug for not aging, right? We're developing it for osteoarthritis or some like monogenic pediatric disorder that has nothing to do with aging, but happens to be mechanistically similar. And I was just like, what the hell? Like, why is nobody actually testing an aging drug for aging? So I initially was working on it for trying to do it in humans, came to, very similar conclusions as everybody else in the field in terms of the challenge, logistically and operationally, of doing that. Yeah. But at the same, while doing that, I had found this interesting paper around big dog short lifespan, and the fact that the bigger a dog is, the shorter their average lifespan is, and there's a 2x differential at the extremes, which is really weird for numerous reasons. But one being that, within a species, you don't see 2x differentials in lifespan. I'm not living 2x longer than I'll pick on him. Greg is really tall. Like, I'm not living 2x longer than Greg because I'm so much shorter than him. And equally, in general, in the mammalian tree, the bigger a mammal is, the longer their lifespan on average is. Think of mouse versus a whale. So long story short, got interested in this, got interested into biology, got the idea of like, you could develop a drug to extend their lifespan by compensating for the historic inbreeding that led to what I believe was an accelerated aging disorder in these big dogs. Basically, the things that made them grow really big in puberty also caused them to age at a faster rate and die sooner. Right. And so I've just been interested in this from like a scientific standpoint. I wasn't like, I'm going to start a consumer pharma company. And so I went to this camping trip that every year the Embark Trucks founders, Brandon and Alex, put on in the Bay Area. And it's because I didn't know anybody. I just like permanently moved here. This was in 2019. And I didn't know anybody. So I got a little bit drunk. And I was sitting on the campfire joking about how I knew how to make their dogs live longer. I think like somebody had a dog there or something. So I was just joking around about that, being an asshole. And a VC there ran into another VC. I feel like I should give them credit. I believe it was Alan Rutledge ran into Ryan Shea, ran into Greg Rosen at YC Demo Day. I'm not 100% sure on that. So sorry, guys, if that's incorrect. And told him about me and like this crazy chick who was like ranting about making dogs live forever. And it turned out he had a thesis in the space. He has a psychotic doodle that he loves a lot and I'm sure spends a lot of money on. And I had been an early investor in Row, which did consumer brand around generic pharma products. Long story short, hunted me down, worked with me for 3 months, helped me like get the confidence to start a company, which I think is like really, really, really important because I never thought of myself. I don't know any founders before like working for Laura.
And around the same time, were you also thinking that having this unlock with extending dog lifespan, that can ultimately lead to humans? Mm-hmm. Or, okay, so like that's the end goal, or at least you put the two together as like a stepping stone.
The thesis has always been the same. Like if you read my seed deck, it's basically extremely ugly and, the micro details are incorrect. The macro is all the same. Even like the timings projected are all the same.
And then, so take me to the moment you sign your first term sheet. It's around $5 million, maybe less, more? Or
they didn't invest that much, but like the round I think was structured to be like 3 to 4 or something like that.
And this is pretty common in biotech where, nothing is actually tangible. You're not selling anything. It's very much in that research phase. But in your mind, what was going through your mind when you're like, shit, I'm in this now? Like there's no real turning back. Was that scary, exciting? How were you thinking through?
I just moved forward. I don't know. I've always just moved forward. I think if you think about it too much, you get terrified. I was just like, I remember I started working on hiring my first employee, like while I was closing the round, like everything was just like moving forward. And I don't know. I've never had like imposter syndrome, I think, because I think everybody's full of bullshit. So I'm like, whatever, I'll figure it out too.
I love that. I really love that. And I think you're right. I think everyone is just, if they're acting like they know what they're doing, then they're faking it, which is good acting.
Yeah.
So during this time, and we're going to talk even more about this, but being a solo founder is hard in any field, right? And especially like biotech is just another field where it could be challenging. Was there a part of you that actually actively sought out a co-founder, or was it just solo? You knew that the whole way?
Yeah, I mean, I even had a woman who's now a good friend. I tried to hire her. I'll give her a shout out, Min Kim. I tried to hire her as my first employee, but she wanted to be a co-founder, and I was like, I don't want a co-founder. I don't know. I'm just like, I never wanted one. I still don't think it's, I mean, I don't know. People who are solo founders are very strong about being a solo founder. People who have co-founders are very strong about co-founding relationships. I don't know. I'm an only child. I don't know what I'm missing in the sibling relationship either. I don't think it's harder. I think it's all hard.
Yeah.
The difference is, you hire for the needs that you have instead of co-founding for them.
Right. And during these early days, what would you say was the hardest part of it that you likely you don't see? You can't prepare for it until you're actually in it. What were some of those moments for you?
Probably all the people stuff. I think one of the reasons I am now, internally backed up about my opinion, or I don't know what the right word is. I feel internally justified about my opinion about being a solo founder is like, I've seen a lot of now, like, you think somebody's great and like you either don't have the context to understand, like, because if you've never worked at a big company or seen a startup you build, you just like don't know what you don't know. And it's not as like, some of it's first principles or whatever, but a lot of it's not. A lot of it's like emotions that you can't actually like principle out, and like different people and how to react to different situations. And it's just like, it's just complex, right? And so I think one of the things for me was just, people who I like were really good in the beginning and then like went off a cliff, or I just like totally handled a situation, or ran to growth walls, or like weren't like me and like didn't want to like, push and grow until the end of time, which is, to be fair, like a much better way to live, like no shade on them. But all the people stuff was just so complex, and it definitely made me like, I feel now 3 years in, confident in my ability to assess somebody's chops for doing what I need now and maybe what I need in a year and a half from now. But not like that confident past then, because I don't know how you predict. Like I don't even like that individual person can predict it unless they've done it before, which is why hiring experience is nice.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's definitely been like the worst and like the most emotional, and it brings out all this like childhood trauma of like how you handle these situations. And
are you talking mainly about that hiring, that early piece, or even beyond that once they've joined?
Hiring, managing, scaling, promotions, firing, rage quitting. Like I've had it all, and it takes like I'm not saying I'm perfect at handling this, but like in the beginning I definitely was like emotionally like attached to the careers and the growth and the like relationship I had with these people, when realistically you always should treat your team members well. I'm like very casual with everybody, but it's also in the end an employment.
Yeah.
And you can't get like so emotionally wrapped into it because it makes you stupid. And my responsibilities to the company and to our future patients, and I guess to my shareholders, more importantly, I think the employees who have equity in the company. So you just got to be logical.
And is that something you really just like growing pains, right? Like you had to learn yourself, or did you end up getting, maybe a coach to help guide you through these conversations, or did therapy help you during this time? Like what almost allowed you to step away from the situation emotionally?
I had I would call it like a executive therapist that I've seen since like day one. That's been really helpful because he helped me see the he helped me see the patterns and like how I would project things onto people. Like I used to get really like, you let me down, right? Like if somebody quit, I was like, or like wasn't scaling, I was like, you let me down, right? Because I felt like people were always letting me down. It's toxic as shit. It's non-productive. It's unprofessional. Da 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 da. Right. But he helped me see those patterns, where those patterns rooted from, etc. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. Everybody has their own like predispositions, and it's important to see, have an outside lens, like see it, especially if you're a solo founder, because nobody's going to tell you.
Right. And beyond, okay, so I can go in a couple different directions here, but I'm going to stick a little bit where what you just mentioned is actually pretty relevant in many different fields, right? Even as I was a student athlete at Stanford, it's so easy to conflate Carly as the soccer player to Carly as a person and a human. And, if one does well, then the other one does well. And if one doesn't do well, then the other one doesn't do well either. And I could very much easily draw a parallel between founding a company and thinking, the success of Loyal is directly correlated to the success of Celine. Do you see that, or have you been able to separate the two?
No, I have no separation. I don't think you can. Like, I don't know, maybe you can, but I have a lot of like toxic views on this stuff, so maybe I should just like not share. But like, I would say the TLDR is, I don't think you can build really great things or like become a really great athlete or whatever it is without it all encompassing you. And it's just like the deal with the devil that you take if you want to do things like that. And I'm sure like there's people who have done that who don't have that case, but I don't know, they're better than me. I
think you're right. And I don't even know if there's a right or wrong, but I do think that it's so common, and it's almost, and maybe there is truth to it in that there is success behind it, right? Like maybe you reach success because you conflate the two so much. I don't know. But anyway, it's super fascinating. So Celine, you ultimately decide you moved to Silicon Valley, and this was maybe years before, but there's also a lot of content out there where that environment actually conduces a really good startup, potentially. And I would love to get your thoughts on how being in SF, being in the tech, hub of it all, how has that impacted your founder journey? And if you think others like yourself, where maybe they didn't think of themselves as founders, but do they need to move to Silicon Valley essentially?
Yeah, so I would caveat that I think a lot has changed since COVID, and also I'm in a different stage of company now. Like I don't go out and like, oh my God, I had this like realization the other day that like I'm the like older generation. Like I'm not the oldest or, whatever, but there is a generation of founders underneath me who are all Gen Z, who are like the cool kids now and like doing the co-living houses and like partying and like, coding shit at
all the hacker houses, all of that. Yeah.
And I'm not in that. And I'm the older guard. I think it's inevitable, right? You can't like, there was a value. So when I first came to the Valley, I spent a lot of time like getting to know people. I didn't know anybody. And that was extremely valuable because the way people think here is so different. And like people like lead with their intelligence. They lead with their ideas. There's just something that UT definitely didn't have. Like I always felt a little bit like not super cool at UT because, a lot of it's about sports or sororities or frats or parties. And of course there's really smart people there too. But at least, I lived in the co-ops. Co-ops are fun, but it was all about like, drugs and parties and, being a hipster or whatever, and music, which like none of that stuff I was really like super into. And in Oxford is like, it's leads with your intelligence, but in a very different way. That's like kind of like, you don't lead with your ambition. You lead with like your knowledge, if that makes sense. And it's very 9 to 5. Like you go to the pub at 5 o'clock and you like drink for the rest of the day. Coming to SF, everybody led with their crazy ideas and their big vision. And everybody was like very clever. Everybody like learned for fun. And I'll always remember I had a guy I was dating briefly. for reasons that might become clear in a second, that said, Celine, when I met you, I didn't think you were very smart, but as I've gotten to know you, I realized you're actually quite clever. And the reason why is because I didn't like communicate. I mean, he was kind of a dickhead, but he also was right because I didn't communicate in a way that led with my intelligence, my context, my ideas. I communicated in the way that was normal everywhere else I had been, which would have gotten maybe not like literally punched in the face, but like figuratively punched in the face for being, an asshole. And SF techies don't do very well in other places. And so I think that was just super helpful for me to get permission to like think in that way and then see people around me starting things and doing things. And again, it was more of that like autonomy. And then just making friends, like my friends, a bunch of us like co-worked together. Now, a lot of them are building really interesting companies. Chris Power and I of Hadrian like started our companies together at the same office at the same time. Same with Nick and Candid. Like, we've done all Nick Perry. We've done all these things together and like grown together, and that's like a really cool opportunity. So the TLDR I say is yes, but there was this middle period with COVID where like SF was the worst place ever.
Right.
And I don't know how it's changed because that was a lot of my SF experience. And then Loyal's now at a size where I'm not going to like tech parties. I'm like writing 360s.
Right.
So like it's just a little bit of a different game now. It's just like a time thing.
So, and it's fascinating to hear almost that description of SF, of leading with intelligence. I think that's a really good, or at least easy framework to lead with. So I really like that. And then beyond being a solo founder, beyond being a first-time founder, obviously you're also a female founder. And being at Longevity Fund, like you probably saw significantly fewer women pitching to you. And just in general, in this space, we know there aren't many women in it. And by the way, I recommend everyone like go look at your website. You have incredible writings on there and it's so candid and vulnerable and authentic. So I really love that. And one thing you wrote almost as a tip for female founders is do not justify yourself to others. You are good enough. Playing into this bias only validates it in their heads. And I very much fundamentally agree, especially with that last part, right? Is when you play into it, you're actually feeding it. Can you talk a little bit about that and how your experience has taught you that?
Yeah. So I oscillate on this stuff a lot because I think there's like a couple of different, like I now am like fundamentally myself when I like pitch my company, when I talk to investors, like the Celine you see is the Celine you get. But I was not that way for a long time because I knew that it wasn't that I'd be pattern matched against, right? So you kind of have to understand which patterns. It's like this weird thing because you can't just be like the male tech founder. Like I can't get away with shit that my male founder deep tech broy friends do. If I did, I'd be like, canceled immediately.
Canceled, yeah.
So like you have to know where the line is, but there are patterns that you need to fit. And then there's also biases you need to preempt. It's kind of like a game that you have to play. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it. Like I tend to get, to our meme of going nuclear, I get really frustrated by it. Like it's, obviously I've not run Loyal perfectly, but I am extremely competent. I've built a good team. I've executed things that people thought in the field is impossible. And I really, really don't like I find coming in neutral, come in with 0, but I can tell when I come in as like a -1 or a -5, and then I have to work my way to neutral and then maybe get them to positive. That irritates me so much. Or I've had like partnership pitches where like the guy just like mansplained my company to me, and I was like, if this was in Zoom, I would throw something at you.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's so irritating, and but you can't, like, you have to just be strategic about when you say things because you can't also become a problem. And you also can't be too, like, I cannot wait until I can confront him one day, but this, like, very well-known partner, when I was raising my seed round, was, like, called me cocky. And, like, I probably, like, did come off as cocky. But he's also probably never said that about a male founder ever, unless it was a compliment. And so, like, the thing is, like, I don't think I'm really answering your question. I think you just have to you have to just play the game. And maybe one thing I would say is something I try to like coach some of my team members on too is figure out which hill to die on. And the higher on the hill you get, the more power you have, right? So like you can be at the bottom of the hill and be screaming about sexism. And it's probably true. Like you're probably having like, sexist biases against you, but you're at the bottom of the hill and the people at the top of the hill, the people with all the money can't hear you and give a shit what you think. You need to play the game to like climb up further and further, and you can pick which like hills to die on, right? Like I died on, my professor's hill, the Aubrey stuff. There's been a few situations where I was like, I'm not going to deal with this, but you're strategic about it. And as I've gotten higher and higher, I've been able to make more difference, right? If I tried the Aubrey thing when I was at the bottom of the hill, nobody would give a shit. And I probably would have just nuked my career. But because I was high enough on the hill at that point, I was able to help a lot of other women who may or may not have run into a similar situation I did with him if Laura and I had not said something. But it also didn't impact me because I was too high up for the downfall to get me, right? And keep on going. If I make Loyal a multi-billion-dollar company, I'm going to be high enough where then I will have the power, the money to influence whatever to help maybe tens of other female founders get started who wouldn't get funded by the douchey GPs who mansplain your company to you. So it's just like a balance. And I think that's the most important thing is you just have to be intelligent about it. And again, it has to be logic combined with emotion where you decide how to handle certain situations.
And I think touching on that, it's even what you're saying as well is, yes, you can fight for it, right? But if you're at the bottom of the hill and you're fighting, you're actually not helping necessarily, right? Like you're not helping other women because you're not strategically getting to the top where, like you said, you're at a place of power and then it could actually trickle down. That's super, I really like that analogy and I think it makes it super clear. So thank you for that. And during your time when you were kind of going back, but when you were at Longevity Fund and you were seeing male pitches versus female founder pitches, was there a big difference? And if so, like what advice would you give to female founders for presenting themselves?
I don't really remember, honestly. And I think some of it might be that, there's so few female GPs, but especially female in bio that maybe there was a difference and I remember it was a long time ago now. I would say in general, it's just not having the right balance between confidence and this is an inevitable future, like get on a train or get off. Yeah. And again, the humbleness that you have to have. For example, I'm extremely confident in Loyal's future. We might not make it, like we might not execute. We might get like smited by the gods. I don't know, but I think it makes sense and I can see the path forward, right? But it's like leading with that like casual confidence is really important. But also not, again, to a previous point, like delving into what people would perceive as cocky.
Speaking of Loyal, where are you guys today? What does your timeline look like for getting a drug out there if you haven't already? But yeah, where are you today? What is most exciting to you?
So company's about 3.5 years old. We've raised like 65-ish. But more importantly, we are running towards hopefully getting our first drug on market, first dog lifespan drug on market in 2025, early 2025, which is really, really cool. We've completed and submitted to the FDA our efficacy studies, so showing that, what we believe demonstrates that it works. Finished the safety, and the majority of the labor right now is around the commercial manufacturing, which is hard, don't get me wrong, but it's not as existential in terms of efficacy. When you're doing something like this, like there is a truth. I always say there's a God in biology, right? Regardless if you're religious or not, in terms of like there's a predetermined truth. Either the drug works or it doesn't. There's nothing you can do to change that truth. You're just trying to figure out the truth as efficiently as possible. And that's like binary. But in my opinion, we have overcome those binary hurdles. Versus manufacturing is much less binary. It is completely possible, and we know it's possible because we've done it, to manufacture a tasty version of this drug that is at the right dose bands, that's scalable, that, doesn't gum up the machine if you're putting tons of kilo on it together. And now it's just about validating these processes, validating supply chain, getting all the inspections done, getting these FDA filings are thousands of pages. And the manufacturing one takes a really long time because a lot of it's like, a lot of it is things like, it's in a humid environment for 6 months. How does it degrade? How well does your bottle keep the humidity, the desiccant, keep the humidity out? Desiccant supply chain, extremely, extremely complex. Who knew? So that's what we're working on right now. And I'm really proud of my team. I think it's still hard. It's there's still stuff that's broken at Loyal, but I really, we feel like a company now. We feel like a business, and we're running and we're doing our shit. And we have 2 other programs around big dog short lifespan, but we're really prioritized on getting this one to market first. Because that'll buy us the right, so to speak, to do everything else.
That's incredible, by the way. So major kudos to you,
Thank you.
and Loyal. And talk me a bit through, what is it like? Because in general, whether it's VC startups, you often do have a long feedback loop. But in biotech, and especially what you're doing now, it's even longer, right? And it takes a long process. Whereas, you start a consumer startup and you see your daily active users, your monthly active users, you get some type of feedback. What does that look like for you? And how does that kind of affect your own mental well-being, if you will?
So there are milestones and there are feedback loops. They're just different, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have the revenue ones. There's things that are more difficult and there are things that are, I think, easier, right? To me, building a consumer startup seems insane. How the hell do you predict whether this social app or whatever is going to take off and be viral and that you're not going to get smushed by 2,000 competitors because everybody can start and compete with you? Versus in drugs, it's can you find something that works or doesn't? That's hard. But if you do, there's a market, there's established distribution channels. There's a maybe if you don't do a longevity drug, but for anything else, there's a relatively standardized way to bring that to market. And people want it. People, there are less medicines than there are, medical needs in the world. And it's, I think, easier to hire, easier to fundraise, depending on the facets of your company. But at least for me, for example, this market's been extremely terrible. And to be clear, it's been harder for us to fundraise than it was previously. I miss the good old days, but we still can. We still have. And I think a lot of that's because, we have a clear path to ROI for any investor who participates in a round that they can, diligence and come to their own conclusions, but generally come to a conclusion that it's a decent bet. But also it's a social good. You feel good about investing in a dog longevity company. It's something you can talk about at dinner. It's easier to recruit. It's easier to get press. We have a ton of press. We haven't even launched yet. So It's pros and cons, but to me, I wouldn't build any other type of company. And I think in some ways it's a company on maybe not easy mode, but slightly less hard mode.
No, I love that. And I love just that because it's so often you hear, like you said, the consumer startup, that's the most common, or at least, away from the tech hub, that's what you see because that's what you're engaging with and that's what you're using. But almost to paint it in a different light, to show that there are positives and the benefits of it, I think is fascinating.
Somebody told me this that I thought was really insightful, which is that there's often there's amount of context or knowledge you need to have to then reach a new oasis that's actually a low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And so I don't know any of consumer startups, but I don't know, find events with your friends, right? The classic whatever, college startup that requires almost no context, and then you're at the low-hanging fruit, which is all rotten or whatever, to torture this metaphor. And then there's further things you can build, and I think Loyal is a low-hanging fruit. You just require a shit ton of context to get there, right? If you were and you had to have the bio context, you had to have the pharma context, you had to have the longevity context, you had to have the consumer context, you had to have the dog context. But then once you're in there, it's actually a low-hanging fruit. So I think that's really important to think about, is finding unaccessed or like more difficult to access low hanging fruit. And then you get a lot of the perks of like the easy startups without all the negatives, right? It being totally picked over or whatever.
Yeah. And I love that, because before you saying that, I wouldn't peg loyal, right? You're doing really hard things. You're at the core extending lifespan in any capacity. And so in my mind, I wouldn't consider it, it's low hanging fruit. But like you said, it's almost just the unaccessed, the ones that haven't been tapped into. And yes, you may need all this context, but again, it's there if you want it. So
yeah,
Celine, I want to know, what craft are you spending your lifetime honing, if you will, away from loyal, just you as a person?
Horseback riding. I ride dressage.
Oh yes, okay. At one point, it was a goal of yours, or maybe it still is. I'm not,
still
but
is.
It's a goal to be in the Olympics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, does 2024 Paris Olympics, is that feasible? Okay, so the next one.
Maybe. The horses you need for that, in addition, not saying I'm there either, but the first boundary condition. The horses you need for that, let's just say Loyal needs to IPO.
Okay.
For that to be a feasibility. But yeah, it's a definite goal. I like ambitious goals.
What does success mean to you? And has this changed over the last 5 years?
That's a good question. I think success for me would be having a drug on market. And that drug being commercially, biologically, medically successful. I have a lot of ego attached to getting the first ever aging drug FDA approved. That would be success. I'm sure once I hit that, like, I would think I'm like, me 5 years ago would probably think I'm already successful, right? I'm like the founder that I admired, that had like cool cover stories, But it turns out when you actually get that shit, you're like, oh, that's great. And then you're like, oh, but I have 50 other problems.
Right.
And also like you then have contacts for the people who are further along, able to do like bigger things. So I guess I would, I don't know, maybe it's like toxic, but I also think it's helpful to keep on, like, if you're just like, oh yeah, like nailed it, Celine, then you're not going to do the next thing. So I think for me, that's
never satisfied in a way.
You have to be never satisfied. Like Hamilton. And yeah, I think that for me would be that I want to create a multi-billion-dollar company. And maybe here's another thing. I really want to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. So like, I don't want to sell this thing. I like want to build a freestanding pharmaceutical company. I think that'd be really cool. I think it'd be very interesting. And I want to learn what it's like to run a company, and none of them are going to hire me. So I just got to do it myself.
Okay. Last question. Celine, what would you say is your superpower?
Learning quickly.
And that's and you've seen that kind of throughout different contexts of your life.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it's not learning in the sense of, like my calculus,
right,
PC or whatever it's called, scores weren't that great. I think it's more of like adapting quickly, learning from context, learning from, like, I was joking with an old investor, one of my first investors, Taylor Green. And he was like, your first board meeting was the worst board meeting I've ever been to. I was like, yeah, it was. It objectively was. It was fucking terrible. But like, instead of like being emotionally attached to what that structure was or whatever, like, it was every single one got better. And like, I would say even like compounded on the other. And I'm not saying I'm like the queen of board meetings. I actually definitely am not. It's really, really hard to run board meetings for a company like this, especially with people with different backgrounds.
Yeah.
But they're definitely not the worst anymore. I would say they're actually like pretty productive. And that was just from learning both these, like, constantly asking for feedback, being like, tell me everything you hated about this, but also just like reading people's facial expressions, reading how they behaved, interpreting what that meant. That's, I think, really important, because you can't pre-learn a lot of this stuff. You have to learn the job, and you have to be your own worst critic to get there. I also thought it was the worst board meeting ever. Not that I had any context, but I fucking hated myself after that meeting. But it's helpful.
It's super helpful.
I told you, toxic.
No, I love it. Celine, I could literally ask you another hour's worth of questions, but I won't. So thank you again for coming on the podcast. It was so great. I learned so much, and it's been great.
Awesome. Talk to you later, Carly.
Thank you so much for listening to the show this week. If you enjoyed, please spread the word. Tell someone about She Leads or post about it on social media and tag us. If you want to contact us, feel free to send over a message through the She Leads Instagram page at sheleads.show. If you want to follow us on Twitter, our account is at SheLeadsShow, and mine is at Carly Malatsky. This episode was produced and edited by Nick Furshow. Thank you also to our partner, Floodgate. If you're passionate about startups and want to learn more about the starting journey of those who have built groundbreaking companies, I highly recommend listening to Starting Greatness with Mike Maples Jr., the founding partner of Floodgate. He has an incredible show that, in my opinion, is definitely worth your time. Thanks again.